You are listening to the Big Blue Marble Podcast with Anwar Knight.
And with that, we begin another show, my friends. So nice to have you along. My name is Anwar Knight. As always, it's a privilege to have your company. Hey, I get it. I know there are only so many minutes in a day, but your decision to share some of those minutes with me, I greatly appreciate it. And I should point out, not just by me, but also Nova, my golden retriever who's warming up my feet today. Yeah, she just heard her name. Okay, no, sit down. She's the dog executive producer, as I like to say, so she always keeps me company here. We actually just came back from a walk about a half hour ago. In fact, doing a lot of that with the family, taking the kids out, exploring some of the ravines and conservation areas in our community. It's always a lot of fun, especially, looking through the eyes of the kids. And a couple of days ago, my youngest son, when we were in one of the ravines here, he noticed a large tree in the forest. And this is it's an old tree. It's, I'm guessing, probably 2 feet in terms of the trunk around. But on the bottom of the tree, by the ground, it was charred. It was burned. Not enough to knock the tree down, mind you, but it looked like maybe some teenage kids were doing a campfire sort of thing, right? Something they should not have been doing. But the burn scars were old, very noticeable, and my son was wondering, he was asking me if this fire would have scared the animals like they did in Australia. And I tried to explain him that no, likely not, and that we don't have, firstly, those type of animals here, and this is a very small forest. We don't have a lot of wildlife, and the fire by our home didn't last long, so it wasn't that dangerous. But the next thing I knew, we were continuing our walk, and we were, as a family, starting to list, or try to list anyway, all of the animals that we know of that come from Australia as we continued our little journey here. And there were a lot of easy ones, the koala and the kangaroo, or as my young son says, the animal with the hole in the tummy, the dingo, and then I came up with the Tasmanian devil. I had to Google a video clip to show the kids that because they didn't believe me. And do you remember that cartoon, the Bugs Bunny days? I got a kick out of it. Anyway, so many amazing creatures, and many of them that most of us will ever know about. And sadly, a lot of them were killed with the devastating fires. Now, I chose not to get into too much detail about the situation there with my kids, but I think it's important as adults that we grasp what is and still happening there and why. As the driest and hottest continent, Australia now is at the forefront of an environmental disaster, and all triggered by climate change. And these fires are likely to still burn right into March. They are in summertime mode. So on today's show, we'll get a first-hand account of the tragedy and the long-term ramifications of losing millions and millions of animals due to the fires. Professor Martine Marin will be joining us in just a moment from the University of Queensland. Before that, though, I just wanted to open up the book on Australia. It's so far away, but it really is an amazing place, especially when you look at its contribution in terms of biodiversity. So think about this for a moment. They have more than 1 million species of plants and animals. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest ecosystem in the world. It's made up of nearly 2,500 individual reefs, and they're so large that you can see it from space. And maybe some of you have actually had the privilege of doing some scuba diving or snorkeling around there. And most of the animals are unique to Australia. No other place on Earth you'll be able to see them. Do you know what a wombat is? Closest relative to a koala bear, but it doesn't look like a koala bear. It's a small marsupial that almost a cross between a bear and a groundhog, if you will. And it's only in Australia, but it's also the only animal in the world that poos square cubes. What? Yes. Its poo is square. It's like dice. It's unbelievable. It's unlike anything else on the planet. Google a picture if you don't believe me. I was floored by it. I just thought it was fascinating. Australia is also home to around 1,500 types of spiders, 4,000 types of ants, 300 types of lizards, over 800 different species of birds. And get this, Australia has a larger population of wild camels, yes, camels, than Egypt. Such a vast collection of wildlife, natural heritage really, that has been tragically impacted from the bottom of the food chain and up by raging bushfires, and some are calling this an animal apocalypse. We'll get a first-hand account on the situation in Australia next.
Have a question, comment, or show idea? Let us know at bigbluemarble.earth.
We cross the seas and head over to Brisbane, Australia now, some 15,000 kilometers away, to welcome Martine Marin to the Big Blue Marble podcast. She is a professor of conservation ecology and environmental management at the University of Queensland.
Thank you.
I can only imagine what the last few weeks have been like in Australia. Such a tragic start to the summer season. And although extreme bushfires certainly happen each year, not like this. I'm wondering, as an ecologist, someone who studies the wildlife and habitat as you do, was anything of this magnitude on the radar, even in the realm of possibility?
Well, we've certainly known for a long time that something like this would be on the cards because, we've probably known for decades that the path of climate change that we're on would be leading to hotter and drier conditions. And in Australia, that translates to more and more extreme fire weather days. So the increase in the risk of a catastrophic event like this has definitely been on the increase. But the scale of this, and to see so many fires in one season, and so early in the fire season too, has caught a lot of people off guard, I think.
Yeah, and I think to some extent it actually caught much of the world off guard. The numbers here are just staggering on all fronts, and it's important to note that the fires are not out yet. There are still some that are burning, and the threat of additional fires is still imminent. But first and foremost, the human toll. More than 30 people have been killed, thousands of homes destroyed, almost 18 million acres have been charred. But the biggest number, by far, is the loss of wildlife. It's estimated now that 1 billion creatures have been killed, and, that number is so hard to grasp. So where does that number come from, and do you think it's accurate?
Yeah, sure. Look, that estimate is likely to be, I'd say, probably a conservative estimate. It was most recently updated before the current extent of the fires, so more area has burnt since that estimate. The estimate itself comes from Chris Dickman at the University of Sydney, who led a review of basically just the density of birds and mammals and reptiles in the sorts of bushland that's burned, and extrapolated that to the burn area. So what's really important to know about that is that actually excludes some mammals, it excludes bats, and it also excludes all of the invertebrates, insects, it excludes frogs, it excludes fish. Fish are the next group that we're really concerned about once the rains have come, because then the ash washes into the waterways and we're already seeing fish kills. So on balance, I would say that's probably a conservative number. Now, some of those animals, of course, in those areas that are burned will have survived, but many of them will have really struggled to escape the heat and the flames because these fires in many cases were just so severe.
Wow. I didn't see that coming, that the numbers you're saying could even be higher. And all of those creatures you just mentioned, they play a crucial role. The invertebrates are the ecological glue that holds ecosystems together and rarely get the spotlight, quite frankly. And your country is home to scores of unique species, some that you'll not find anywhere else in the world. Take, for example, what for many is really an iconic ambassador of Australia, that of the koala bear. And I know there have been many efforts done by professionals and volunteers of late to rescue and save some of these animals. But it has been extremely challenging. They're so fragile in the best of times. Do you think there's a risk that some animals, such as the koala, could be pushed to extinction because of these fires?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge worry because these fires are affecting, Australia looks like a big place, but it's actually got a relatively narrow strip, along the east coast and southwest WA where there are forests, and so fires of this extent really affect quite a large proportion of the habitat that remains for so many species. Now, koalas actually have quite a wide distribution, so a relatively small amount of their total habitat would have been burnt. One of the most heartbreaking things about this is the animal welfare impacts. So the fact that there is just so much suffering and loss of individuals. But from a threatened species perspective, Australia has so many species that occur nowhere else on the planet, and about 1,700 species and ecological communities were already threatened with extinction, before this event. So what we're really focused on as a conservation science community now is to identify which of these species have been most impacted by these fires and which of them are likely to be extra susceptible now to extinction. The koala is probably not one of the top concerns from the perspective of the risk of it being completely wiped out, but there are some species we're really worried about.
Which ones? Can you highlight some?
So some of the species, and of course we're at really early stages of mapping the extent of these burns. Even within some burn scars, there may be patchiness, so there may be areas where things have escaped. But on Kangaroo Island, it's really clear the impact is likely to be severe. So Kangaroo Island is a really large island off South Australia, and it has some endemic species and subspecies that occur nowhere else. A couple of those are the Kangaroo Island glossy black cockatoo. So it's, as you'd imagine, a beautiful black cockatoo with a red tail, stunning bird, and the Kangaroo Island dunnart, which is a really cute little tiny marsupial. Both of them only numbered in the hundreds before this event. Both of them, most of their habitat has been burnt. And the problem is that particularly the glossy black cockatoo, it's a really picky feeder. So it only feeds on drooping she oak trees. And the drooping she oak trees, most have been burnt. And that means we have to get new trees in the ground as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, while we wait for those trees to grow and new food to be provided, these birds are going to need a lot of support, and there's a really significant risk to their ongoing viability. And those are the sorts of things that are being played out for quite a few species across eastern and southwestern Australia at the moment.
And just as a point of reference for our listeners, as you mentioned, Martine, Kangaroo Island is in the south coast of South Australia. So if you picture a map of Australia, in the southern central coast, if you will, it's about 100 kilometers southwest of Adelaide, about a 45-minute ferry ride from the mainland.
That's right. And because it's an island, it's managed to retain a lot of populations of species that are actually extinct on the mainland. So it's really important from a conservation perspective. But the majority of native vegetation on the island has now been burnt in a really hot fire. So some of the images that we're getting from the island are really quite tragic.
So the habitat, which is home for thousands and thousands of creatures, has now been scorched. It's essentially a wasteland. How does that play out in the future? What lies ahead here for the surviving species?
Yeah, well, it's really important to remember that the places that are burned, that look shocking now, and from which many of particularly the fauna, will have either died in the fires or died from a lack of resources, they're not really wastelands. These are the places that will recover. So they will recover with time in most cases, not all cases. So there were places that were burned that never normally burn. Some rainforest was burnt. That's almost unheard of, some dry rainforest. So these are ecosystems that probably won't recover and will shift. But most of these landscapes, they will recover, and the focus needs to be on supporting the species that are now going to be without resources while they recover, and giving those landscapes every opportunity to come back. And in some cases, that's going to take years, in some cases, decades. But we need to make sure that we identify what are the needs of the particular species that are going to be most affected, and how best can we support them.
I guess there's no blueprint here, right? Are there any other examples in the world where a similar situation has occurred and lessons can now be applied here when it comes to the day after?
Wow, I just don't know of anything that was quite so extensive. This has affected, almost every state of Australia has been caught up in this just extraordinary series of fires. And so resources are really stretched. So there's not really a blueprint for how do we act. But the really positive thing is that people in the state government agencies, the Commonwealth government agencies, and the ecological community in Australia have worked together really quickly to put that plan together. Collectively, we do have the knowledge, at least initially, to identify what are the priorities, what do we need to do, where and when. And governments have been really supportive of that. Everybody's been working together. There's an initial task force been put together to help lead that effort with some absolutely outstanding scientists. And so I think that the initial reaction has been as good as we could hope, and the coordination process is kicking off.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm wondering, with that help and the fact that animals, they're resilient, they have this natural survival instinct, can we assume that some animals, maybe like birds, they took flight, or some other animals dug deep down in the soil? Is there any hope that those animals survived and maybe have relocated and possibly could reestablish their place? Or does this make them more vulnerable?
Yeah, certainly. So animals that couldn't flee would have been the most immediate casualties from the heat and from the smoke. But as you say, there's a lot of adaptations there. Fire is a normal part of the Australian landscape. So many of our species have pretty good responses to at least sort of patchy fires, not so much to the extensive ones we're seeing now. And things like the burrows of wombats, it's quite a large, dumpy-looking burrowing marsupial. Lots of animals can actually take shelter in those burrows. We do have species that dig down into the soil. Those species will have, in some cases at least, been able to escape the worst of the fires that went through, at least in the cases where the fires perhaps weren't as extreme in their severity. Some birds, as you say, will have been able to fly away, but we know that many become disoriented by the smoke, and we know there have been a lot of casualties there. The biggest problem is actually, then what? Where do they go? Well, if most of their habitat is burnt, if they re-emerge from these burrows and there's no food and there's no shelter, that's when the risks hit. So what do they eat and how do they stay safe? One of the biggest issues we have in Australia in conservation is introduced feral predators, cats and foxes especially. So almost 30 species of mammals, I think, have gone extinct in Australia, most of them due to these introduced predators. And our native animals are just not very good. They're just not adapted to respond to this threat. And the problem is these sorts of predators are really effective in burnt areas. So there is nowhere for our native animals to hide once an area is burnt out. So these are the sorts of risks that they're now facing.
Do you think there will be some good news in the coming days or weeks ahead? Some surprise survival stories?
I hope so, yeah. I mean, look, we don't anticipate that these burnt out landscapes are going to be completely devoid of animals. It's just that the abundance and certain species will be particularly affected. But we've already seen stories of hope. So the Wollemi pine, for example, so most of the species affected are actually plants. And that's where it becomes really important to understand, well, how do these different plant species respond to fire? Which ones are sensitive and which ones are quite able to respond and resprout or reseed after fire? Many of our plant species can do that. But the Wollemi pine, an absolutely ancient plant, can't. It was rediscovered in some gullies in New South Wales not that long ago, and a really special firefighting effort was able to save that stand of trees from disappearance. Everyone was really worried, and to see the images of that stand of such important trees having been saved was a really, really heartening thing. Hopefully there'll be more stories like that.
Yeah, that really was an amazing story. I have seen that image as well. In fact, I'll post that picture in this episode's show notes at www.bigbluemarble.earth. For our listeners, be sure to check it out. You have to see this. It's a charred landscape all around, except for this mini ravine where this small cluster of ancient pine trees were saved, about 200 or so, and they've nicknamed them the dinosaur trees, as there are fossil records that show that they've existed, 200 million years ago. So it's the only tree of its kind in the world. So clearly, the vegetation is a huge part of this tragedy. It provides the habitat for many species and will also need to be addressed in the recovery.
Absolutely. And, the majority, I think 272 different threatened plant species have had at least 10% of their distribution burnt. So the push to understand that is a bigger challenge than the push to understand how our different fauna species are likely to be affected, because plant responses in a complex continent like Australia are really, really varied. And understanding how to support that recovery is just equally important, if not more important, because as you say, not only are they important in their own right as unique plants that mostly occur nowhere else, they are also habitat for everything else that lives in the ecosystem.
Over the years, there have been many documented instances of wild animals responding in advance of a disaster, a sixth sense, if you will. And one of the most prominent examples that I can recall was the tsunami, I guess it was in 2004. There appeared to be very few animal casualties, and some reports were suggesting that they fled to higher ground in advance of that tsunami rolling in. Could that be possible here?
Yeah, it's remarkable to hear stories like that. I haven't heard stories like that from these bushfires. In the Australian bush, when a fire comes through under normal circumstances, non-extreme circumstances, animals will naturally take to shelter in the ways they normally would, in the canopy, inside hollows, in burrows. When fires turn out to be so severe and so extreme that those places aren't safe anymore, those strategies sort of fall apart. And of course, the problem with fleeing is that in a lot of cases, there's really nowhere for them to flee to. And if animals do find some unburnt habitat, well, you can imagine that you have a vast number of other animals crowding into that. It's not going to be enough to support all of those animals. So many of the deaths, sadly, will occur after the fires because there just are not enough resources to support all the animals that may have escaped the immediate impact of the flames.
And there has been some support in that regard from your government. If I have the number correct, some $50 million in aid to help flora and fauna. And I've seen some stories where they're doing the helicopter drops of food, sweet potatoes and carrots, to help some of the wildlife. Is that geared for a particular species?
Yeah, for some species, that's right. The sorts of species that they're doing food drops for, they're things like rock wallabies. So they're, like really cute sort of kangaroo-looking things, very rare, only occur in these rocky outcrops. So when those outcrops are burnt, they're able to survive because they can hide in amongst the rocks. But when they come out, there's nothing for them to eat. And because they're really tied to those rocky outcrops, they can't go far to find food. So that's why that temporary provision of food is important. But something that's probably going to be even more important on a widespread basis is to get in there and try to redouble our efforts to manage the threat of predation from cats in particular and foxes that, as I've said, particularly take advantage of these sorts of situations and might be there picking off the sort of survivors that we really need to reseed new populations. So emergency feral animal control, some supplementary feeding, and also the identification and protection of those bits of vegetation that didn't burn. I think that's going to be really critical over the coming months and years.
It is a monumental task that lies ahead. Martine, can I ask you, what's your greatest fear?
Well, as a scientist, I suppose, from my perspective, my greatest fear is that people will sort of react and in a way that fails to use the best science to underpin the responses that we know we need to put in place here. So there is misinformation out there and misunderstanding, particularly about things like fuel reduction burning. So to put the practice of putting through low intensity burns at safe times to reduce the amount of fuel on the forest floor that would otherwise carry a fire. So this is a really critical part of fire management in many places, but it is not a silver bullet. And the key thing is, while there are calls for more of this to be done, the fact is that climate change is reducing the window during which we can safely do those burns. So one of our most important tools for managing these events is actually becoming less effective just as we need it most. So we need to think beyond this knee-jerk reaction, the idea that what we need is more fuel reduction burning. And we need to think more holistically about how do we keep moisture in landscapes? How do we make landscapes safer for people and animals in a fundamentally changed climate?
And without question, it has changed. You certainly know that 2019 was the hottest and driest year ever recorded in Australia, and countless experts are saying this is clearly a signature of the climate crisis that's unfolding right before our eyes. And you are in agreement with that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's entirely unequivocal. This is exactly what was predicted. In fact, it was predicted in a government commissioned report in 2008, which directly stated there would be an increase in the numbers of extreme fire weather days, and that this in effect will increase over time, but should be directly observable by 2020. It's a direct quote.
Then why has there not been a response? Looking from across the pond here, the Australian government seems to be very passive, almost in denial. And for the record, Canada is not much better, but the impacts in Australia are so dramatic, so tragic, you would think at this point there would be no question now.
Yeah, you would think, and I certainly hope that, that the community really gets behind stepping up of efforts to place Australia as a leader in responding to climate change, because we are just so susceptible, not just our species, but our people as well. And I think that has been made very, very clear to people during this past season just gone, or in fact, this season that we're still in the middle of. These severe events, we can't turn back the clock, and we can't stop these things from happening now that we're on a path to climate shifts that increase the risk. But what we can do is we can act in a way that tries to reduce how much worse these things will get, and to try to adapt and help our fauna adapt as much as possible to this future that we've already locked in some of the change, but we really need to think carefully about how much more climate change do we want to allow ourselves to lock in.
Well, clearly the world is watching, literally. And maybe this is the calling card that will rally the world leaders to act so they can avoid other major disasters such as this. As we wrap up, Martine, can I ask you, how are Australians coping as a people, as a community?
It's, as I say, it's been an extremely emotional time for so many people on so many levels. And obviously, as you said at the opening, people have died, and thousands of people have lost their homes, and millions of people have been directly affected by this incredibly thick smoke, and also just by the loss of places in nature that they love. You know, I work with so many people who are deeply connected to the places and the species that are affected, and they're really struggling to process this event. Indigenous Australians are seeing the country they belong to and really culturally significant species affected by this. But with such an enormous event, I think it really has had a national impact. Even those far from the fires are recognising how significant this is. And I just hope that that will to respond and that will to care better for nature is something that is going to stick around beyond this fire season, so that we don't end up facing something like this again.
Martine, thanks so much for this. I know it's a very difficult time, and we really appreciate you joining us and really helping us connect the dots to this powerful story. I know there are many people around the world, especially your friends here in Canada, that wish you all continued strength as you deal with this devastating crisis.
Thank you so much.
My guest has been Martine Marin. She is a professor of conservation ecology and environmental management at the University of Queensland. Time to travel the world now as we open up another edition of the Blue Files. Researchers say they are one step closer to saving the northern white rhino from extinction. Today it is believed there are only 2 of this rhino species left on the planet, Najin and Fatu, both females that live in a conservation park in Kenya. Using eggs taken from the females and inseminated with frozen sperm from dead males, Researchers have now successfully created a third embryo that'll be eventually transferred into a surrogate mother, a southern white rhino, in the coming months. The ultimate goal is to create a herd of at least 5 animals that could one day be returned to their natural habitat in Africa, a process that could take decades. A perfect storm of interacting elements is causing the collapse of global biodiversity and ecosystems across the tropics, says a new study. Researchers mapped over 100 locations where tropical forests and coral reefs have been devastated by climate extremes, including hurricanes, floods, heat waves, droughts, and fires. Experts involved in the study claim the only way to prevent further damage is to cut carbon dioxide emissions. They stress the urgent need for all nations to act together if we really want to conserve tropical forests and coral reefs for future generations. Lead researcher Dr. Philippe Franca also says many local threats to tropical forests and coral reefs, such as deforestation, overfishing, and pollution, reduce the diversity and functioning of these ecosystems, which in turn can make them less able to withstand or recover from extreme weather. In some regions, such as the Caribbean islands, extreme weather events have decimated wildlife, reducing numbers by more than half. It's a global problem, and a team of chemists at McMaster University in Hamilton may have discovered a solution. Billions of vehicle tires are manufactured and purchased worldwide with no real cost-effective method of recycling them. Most end up in massive landfills or storage facilities. But now a team from the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at McMaster have found a way to dissolve the rubber using a unique process that breaks down the sulfur-to-sulfur bond. Michael Brook, the author of the study, compared the rubber structure to a fishnet or fabric, and the chemical catalyst that they use as a type of molecular scissors that will cut through the threads in one direction so that the net becomes a series of ropes, which then can be processed and efficiently recycled. While promising, researchers caution that the new method has some limitations because it is expensive for industrial applications. But without question, this is a huge leap forward in tire disposal. And that's this edition of the Blue Files. And just before we wrap up, your questions answered with the inbox. This one is from Paul in Toronto, who asks, if climate change is energized by higher carbon dioxide levels, wouldn't that actually benefit farmers who grow crops, as plants require carbon dioxide for photosynthesis? It's a really good question, and the science and research on that continues to evolve. And I was sourcing out some reports on it, and to some extent, yes, it is true. CO2 is essential for photosynthesis, and in fact would speed up the process, which in theory is good, faster growth and a bountiful crop. But here's the problem, Paul, is that too much carbon dioxide, that certainly helps the plants transform sunlight into food, would actually nurture more carbohydrates like glucose, and it would be at the expense of other essential nutrients, so less iron, zinc, a host of protein or vitamins and minerals, depending on the crop that you're growing. So although it may be growing quickly, it's less nutritious. And this wouldn't only affect humans, but any other living creature that manages to be in the food chain here. And plants are a critical source of protein in the developing world. And the current research suggests, listen to this, that within 30 years, that 150 million people may be at risk of protein deficiency, particularly in the developing world because of climate change. So it's just another example, though, of the impacts that are close to home. Dwindling nutrition as we continue to burn fossil fuels. And, maybe even more important, the fact that a part of this equation is, of course, the long-term impact, with rising CO2 already causing droughts and heat stress. So together, I think it outweighs any benefit, and we have a lot more to lose than gain. But I thank you for the question. That's what this is all about, us learning together the everyday impacts. And you can send in your question to askus@bigbluemarble.earth, and maybe we'll answer your question on a future episode. By the way, that's the email address as well to enter our contest. What contest? Well, we're giving away tickets to the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. It's, of course, the official home to the Stanley Cup and the finest collection of hockey artifacts in the world. It's really just a great place for the whole family, with engaging exhibits and interactive activities that all celebrate the history of ice hockey. So how do you win it? You have to subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll find all the details in there. The easiest question on the planet. And that contest is exclusively for Big Blue Marble newsletter subscribers. I send it out once a month, and it features a whole bunch of great stories, and it's all free. So there's no cost to this. Subscribe on our website, enter the contest, and you can win. On January's edition, we got some really cool stories, like the world's first carbon-negative vodka. How does that sound? And a look at the dirty side of the shipping industry. You know Carnival Cruise Lines? Yeah, I've been on them too. They are the world's largest luxury cruise operator, and according to a sustainable transport group, Transit Environment, they emitted 10 times more sulfur oxide into the atmosphere around European coasts than, get this, than all 260 million cars in Europe in 2017. It's astounding. And did you know about it? I didn't. So big changes in the shipping industry are now finally happening. You can read all about that and more in January's edition of the newsletter. Now, if you missed it, subscribe now and I'll send it your way. Again, all free. It's on the website, bigbluemarble.earth. You'll see a link there. You can submit it in. We'll get it out to you. A big shout out to Susie Q, Charit Tapp, Marianne Corkish, and Jessica Bayanetta 2. All BBM supporters, thank you so much for retweeting my Big Blue Marble post. Really appreciate it. The more that can join in, the more we can inspire to be a part of the change that needs to happen. If you're liking the show or have any suggestions, please let me know. That's the magic of this platform. It's a piece of clay, really, that can be molded in any way. And on that note, please subscribe to the show. That ensures that you'll be the first to know when the next episode is available. And leave a review if you can. That's how the Apple gods determine when they promote a show. 5-star is always good, just a hint. And of course, share it. Share the link, tell your friends, your coworkers, and let's all help heal the planet together. That's it for now, my friends. I'm Anwar Knight, wishing you a great day on the Big Blue Marble.
Hey, Dad, that was an awesome show.
Oh,